If you haven't already, you'll hear us talk about the hormone insulin quite a bit. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about why insulin matters, and in particular why it matters when you're suffering from obesity and other metabolic diseases. We will dig a little deeper into insulin in other tutorials, but this can be an overview, if you will, to help you understand why you need to have some basic knowledge about it to be successful with our program. Now, firstly, most of you will have heard about insulin before, and you probably associate it with the nutrient glucose. Many diabetics have to inject themselves with insulin to control their blood sugar levels, and some athletes even use it to enhance muscle growth, and potentially quite dangerously, I might add. However, most of the time when we, as your metabolic doctors, are talking about insulin, we're referring to the insulin that our own bodies make, because it is, after all, a natural and very important human hormone. Insulin is made in the pancreas, which is a gland at the back of the abdomen, and the primary stimulus for its release is when our blood glucose levels rise. And the biggest stimulus for our blood sugar level to rise is when we eat carbohydrate foods, in particular starches and sugars. And the most famous role of insulin is to signal cells to take up that glucose and remove it from our bloodstream. Now, we always need some glucose or sugar circulating in our blood, particularly for the brain to work properly. But too much glucose circulating for too long can cause tissue damage, which is essentially what diabetes is. So we've learned to consider insulin as a good thing, jumping into action to prevent blood glucose from going too high and shuttling that glucose into cells where it's kind of out of harm's way. However, I think what often gets forgotten is that the so-called glucose-centric model of insulin ignores some oft-forgotten complexity that bears very heavily, particularly if you're prone to obesity and metabolic disease. Now, we know that insulin can work on every cell in the body. It's not limited to just fat cells or muscle cells. What I'd like to do now is take you through what happens when slowly over time our insulin levels get too high and stay high, and how this causes problems. If you're watching this and been to our clinic or due to come to our clinic, this is very relevant to you and has almost certainly happened to you. Those of us who live in Western civilizations are generally eating what I would term an industrialized Western diet, and this is certainly true for Kiwis. This is a diet where the most dominant nutrient eaten is carbohydrate, particularly refined carbohydrates and sugars. And for most of us, this makes up at least 50% of what we eat every day. These are the foods that cause the largest rise in blood sugar, and as such, they cause the highest rise in insulin from our pancreas, because we need that insulin to deal with all the glucose. Now, one of the main jobs of this insulin is to push that glucose into our fat cells, where it's turned into white fat and stored. And fat cells are very good at growing, but once they get to about 20 times their original size, they actually risk rupturing. So they have to fight against any further growth, and they do this by becoming resistant to the effects of insulin. So they've become insulin resistant in a desperate act of self-preservation. So this means that because the insulin isn't as effective anymore, our pancreas needs to release even more of it to have the same effect, because it still needs to clear glucose from the blood. These high insulin levels can have quite a number of problematic effects on other body tissues, such as our muscle and the liver, before eventually these tissues become insulin resistant themselves. Now, if this goes on long enough, eventually even the increasingly higher and higher levels of insulin can no longer push glucose into the insulin resistant cells, and diabetes results, which is a high blood sugar. But even years before diabetes develops, there has been damage occurring from these high levels of insulin. So the state of insulin resistance arises largely from a long-term dietary pattern that is rich in refined carbohydrates and sugars, and it has two important components. Firstly, there is resistance of critical tissues to the effect of insulin. Firstly, fat, but later followed by muscle, liver, and other important tissues. And secondly, there are constantly high circulating levels of insulin. The medical term we use for this is hyperinsulinemia. Almost all people suffering from obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other metabolic diseases have insulin resistance as an underlying cause of that disease. That's why it's so important for us to focus on the role of insulin and controlling and then reversing that insulin resistance. So to finish, we should discuss why insulin resistance is bad and how it can contribute to excess weight and obesity in particular. To understand this, we need to go right back to basic science, which involves growing fat cells on a petri dish. Now, we can grow fat cells and many other human cells in a culture on a petri dish. And if we have a fat cell and we bathe it in nutrients including glucose and fatty acids, it won't grow, and none of those nutrients will be taken up unless we also drip some insulin into that dish. Only at that point will the fat cell grow. So insulin presence is an absolute requirement for fat cell growth, and is actually also required for fat to be maintained in storage in a fat cell. So it follows that if insulin levels are persistently high, the fat cell is largely unable to release fat for use because insulin holds it in place. So people with insulin resistance and consequently high insulin levels struggle to move fat out of their fat cells for burning. Now, this is why weight loss cannot be achieved in the presence of high insulin, and why strategies to slowly and consistently lower your insulin levels are so important to help you achieve your goals of weight loss and better metabolic health. Now, I acknowledge that this discussion has been a substantial oversimplification of the role of insulin and insulin resistance in metabolic disease. The intent is to provide an overview only. Why is this relevant to bariatric surgery? Well, it's very relevant because a dietary pattern that helps you keep your insulin low will be critical to the long-term success of your surgery. We look forward to discussing this further with you.